to the University of Birmingham. I'm joined here in the office today by James Pugh on my left and Matthew Powell on my right, who've been your mentors over the course of this MOOC. And tell me, guys, what's the feedback been like? How do you think it's gone so far, Matthew?
I think it's been an overwhelming success. A lot of people have got an awful lot out of the course, not just in terms of the discussions that we've had, but also the references that have allowed them to explore some of the things that we've talked about in a bit more depth and at their own pace.
That's good.
No, I think that's absolutely fair. I think one of the great things is the course that keeps on giving. So whilst the 3 weeks, it's a really short, it's a really short introduction. We put a lot into producing reading lists and references and source material, which you've all got access to, until the course is taken down, which I believe it won't be. And you can continue to look for those resources for months and months at a time, I hope.
Yeah, it's the sort of thing that there is always material to be taken from it. And if it whets the appetite for more study, that's all the better.
I'll just add one more thing if I can. And I think that a lot of people arrive at aviation history, I know I did, with a fascination with the kit. And I made airfix models. Well, I probably still do occasionally, and you arrive here and you're hoping it's all going to be about the guns and the planes and things. And you're hit with that Tennyson poem up front. You're like, well, what have I walked into here? And then it's just about exploring air power in that wider context. And for some, I think that's been a frustrating experience because they're here for the kit. But for other participants, it's been there's a lot more here to air power than just that. And I mean it's so much fun being part of a team where you can sort of open someone's eyes to to completely new ways of thinking about stuff.
Yeah, there's a lot in that, James. I think the 3 weeks is a very short period of time, but all the research that's been done around MOOCs has shown that 3 weeks is about right to retain people and retain people's attention. One of the things that we're looking at is to run a longer MOOC, possibly a 4 or a 5 week one, on a really meaty specific topic, such as the strategic air offensive, but we'll let people know when that happens, if it happens. In terms of this week in particular, Matthew, have there been any key themes coming out?
One of the key themes that certainly has come out and is particularly relevant to the research I'm conducting at the moment is Baldwin's speech that the bomber will always get through, and how prepared Britain was in the 1930s in terms of the aviation industry, its economy, and its ability to sustain a prolonged rearmament drive.
Yeah, I think Baldwin's speech, which is obviously one of the reasons that we chose to put it in there, is one of those things that appeals at different levels as you go up. And it's been quoted and misquoted so many times in so many different contexts. And I've been guilty of that in the past, as many people have. The bomber will always get through. But when you look at Baldwin in the wider context, when you look at Middlemass and Barnes, his biographers, they recount in some depth how upset and disappointed Baldwin was having to make that speech and how disappointed he was after it. And you just start, it's almost like an onion coming apart. You get different levels, level after level after level. And that is pretty much true throughout air power history. You can do the same sort of analysis with the likes of Churchill, etc., etc. Key elements that have arisen this last week.
You pinched my idea then, Matt. I'll just reiterate from a slightly different point that it was a lot of participants have particularly enjoyed looking at the Baldwin quote in its wider context, and that's why when we put that together, I deliberately went to the Hansard record and included all of it. And I know that there's been a few. I think I had a good discussion with is it Bud Field on there? Has been Bud's been such an interesting guy to speak to, and it's just that wider context and seeing that he's using these terms and he's using this language to really grab your attention because he thinks this is a really important issue, and that's been one of the main things I've taken. Another thing I think was about the creation of the RAF, and there's been a few comments around Trenchard and Rothermere, and we sort of skirt over why they both lose their jobs. And there's some really interesting. Well, I mean, you know more about this than most, Peter. So would you
I
like
was going to say it's part of your.
Well, yeah. I
PhD.
mean, it's
Well,
it's quite interesting because some people weren't really sure where Rothermere why is he involved, and one of the main reasons he's involved is because the bloke they ask first is his brother, Lord Northcliffe, who owns the Times and Daily Mail. He's a critic of British air power policy throughout the First World War, and pressures the government to such an extent that when they create an air ministry, they feel he's the right man for that post. And astonishingly, he writes open letters in both the publications he owns and says, I'm not going near this with a barge pole. But he's still incredibly influential, and so they approach his brother in essence to sort of lead by proxy, almost, I suppose. And then in terms of wider disagreements with Trenchard, Trenchard has many gifts and becomes a very astute political operator later on. But at this point, I do not think he grasps what he's being asked to do, what the role of the Chief of Air Staff is. He thinks he's there to run the whole department rather than sort of running the military aspects of that.
Yeah.
And I mean, you know more about that, in terms of the interfacing and how that works. It's something he becomes good at. But
yeah, he gets the idea eventually because he's had a year or so to think about it after a pretty miserable start. Trenchard is very much one of these people, self-made man, who knows what he would have become had he not learned to fly and joined the Royal Flying Corps. I think there's a bit of opportunism there, and that's certainly true throughout the rest of his career. The Northcliffe Rothermere saga is, we could almost say that Lloyd George was trying to get them inside the tent as opposed to outside the tent, quite literally. And there was an element of that. The politics in Whitehall was such that they were heading towards victory. They knew that the Germans were wearing down. Let's try and get a grip of this. I'll come back to the formation of the RAF side of it. Trenchard goes off to the Independent Air Force, runs the Independent Force in France, and continues in his dogged determination of offence, offence, support Hague, offence, offence, support Hague, and so on onwards until the very end of the First World War. When Churchill brings him back to office in 1919, he's learned his lesson. He's learned the fact that he's going to have to negotiate with the Treasury. He's going to have to negotiate with civil servants, that he's not just there to run a field air force, but from London. He's got to run an administration. And running an administration is something that doesn't come naturally to field officers. Bearing in mind, he started the war as a relatively old, but still junior officer who just didn't have the streetwise knowledge of what we call Whitehall today, but it was obviously spread much more widely around London at the time. And Trenchard eventually gets the message and leads the Air Force for the next decade. I think it's worth putting the formation of the Royal Air Force into a slightly wider context. We talk, and we've given you links to the Smuts report, which was largely down to the air defence of Great Britain. But I think we need to recognise that there were bureaucratic reasons why, first of all, there had to be an air board, then an air council, and eventually there had to be an air ministry so that they could have their own vote, their own money to buy airframes and to buy engines. So there are strong bureaucratic reasons for the formation of an independent air ministry. With an independent air ministry, we probably need an air force to run with it. It takes some of the gloss away from a centenary from 100 years ago, the formation of the Royal Air Force, for logistical reasons and procurement reasons, but it's there.
Well, I think that's really important. I mean, I was speaking at the RAF Museum about 2 weeks ago on the Royal Flying Corps in 1915, and I bored my audience to tears by talking about the importance of establishing an administrative routine, and getting orders typed up and things like that. And there are a lot less glamorous reasons for establishing these organisations. But a really interesting point, and I wondered if you two had thoughts on it. I can't remember which historian it is. It's either Malcolm Cooper or Neville Jones makes the point that by the time the RAF, they're considering getting the RAF, created. The Cowdrey Airborne at that point has already sort of almost settled the supply issues. They've actually sorted things out. And this linked onto a wider question, and I've asked a few of our MOOC participants to comment. Could you have seen a situation in which the RAF is not created during the First World? I don't want to get too counterfactual here, but I suppose that's what I'm asking you actually. You know, what would have happened? I mean, could the British have gone through the interwar years without an independent air force?
I personally don't think so. I could probably, that's pretty predictable really coming from me, but nonetheless, I think you get the business of, yes, we needed an air board, yes, we needed an air council, yes, eventually we needed an air ministry, but we also needed, critically, the press in particular, the public opinion as well. We needed to demonstrate that we were putting the effort in to defending London, to defending the United Kingdom airspace. And that's as relevant in 1916, 17, 18, 19, 20 as it is today with Russian bears off Cornwall.
Yeah.
We have to defend UK airspace. And it's the sort of thing that when it goes wrong, it goes spectacularly wrong, and politicians are held responsible.
Mm.
If you've got the army saying it's the Navy's job and the Navy saying it's the Army's job, there's only one solution. You have an air force. And people were savvy enough in the interwar years, Churchill in particular, as Minister, as Secretary of State for War and Air, to know that if you got rid of the Air Force, the first thing that would go, that would be rubbed from the slate, would be air defence of the United Kingdom. So I see the interwar years as essential for the survival of the RAF, but the Royal Air Force for the survival of the United Kingdom. Mm-hmm. Or at least demonstrating the ability to do that. Do you want to add to that, Matt?
I think you've covered it fairly well. I don't think there's anything more I can add.
Okay. I think the final thing from this week's posts, from this week's discussion, it's been really interesting looking at faith in air power. And some of the discussions that we've had on does air power win wars alone? And I don't think any of us in this room, any of the air power advocates that I know around the globe, would actually turn around and say air power can do it alone. I don't think it can, and virtually none of my peers would ever suggest that. It has to be part of a combined and joint and multinational, etc., all the standard things that we've seen in many conflicts over the last 25 years. But what we have to remember is that on many occasions, the politicians do not want to put boots on the ground. And air power offers them, whether it's in conventional aeroplanes, in stealthy aeroplanes, in big aeroplanes, in little aeroplanes, or in unoccupied aeroplanes. Mm-hmm. It gives them the option of distancing themselves from casualties, distancing themselves from over-involvement, and yet they're doing something. It's not a magic bullet, but it's a pretty attractive solution for politicians.
Yeah. I mean, but and there's a history to there, of course, which links to the period after, well, the interwar years, and particularly air policing around the British Empire.
Yeah,
and that's there is a big focus in the history about how important strategic bombing is to the RAF, and I think that there's a more nuanced understanding coming through now that air policing, i.e. using police to sort of supplement boots on the ground around the empire, was also a really, really important reason for the RAF, continuing to exist.
I think the air policing side of it is really quite interesting. The senior officers at the time in the Royal Air Force, most of whom, not all, but most of whom had been army officers themselves, intuitively understood what was required in these far off places in Mesopotamia, in Somaliland, etc. And in Iraq, in Mesopotamia, you see the Air Force operating alongside armored car squadrons. The bit that always amuses me is that they were RAF armored car squadrons. And that when Air Marshal John Salmond was out there, he wasn't just Joint Air Component Commander, he was Joint Land Component Commander as well.
Charge,
How are we doing on the Hangout, James? Have we got lots of questions coming in?
Not at the moment, but there are plenty that people have sort of put to us during the course of the week. And one of them that's come about again is for linking to independence and continuing independence is, and this is right up to date, and I thought I'll surprise you with it, is do we need a Royal Air Force still? And I think this is particularly pertinent. I mean, could aviation be used within the service environments as we speak? Is there a strategic role for air power still, is what I'm saying in essence?
You just have to look at the events of the last 25 years, and I in terms of deploying air power in an operational environment, that can only really be done by airmen who've lived, eaten, breathed, been trained, educated, and grown up with air power and understand how to use it. Some of the debates that we see every 5 years now that we have a strategic defence review every 5 years have centred around ownership of assets. And that's a pretty torrid argument. Are we going to save huge volumes of money? No, we're not. What you run the risk of is, as they would have done in the early 1920s, is if you get rid of the Air Force, it'll be asset stripped by the other two services, and you won't be any further forward. I think if you look at various operations, if you look in particular at Operation Allied Force, and if you look at some of the lessons learned afterwards, that where you have a senior land commander demanding that Serbian army tanks are, quote, plinked, unquote, that the Serbian army, the Yugoslav National Army, is the center of gravity, all very Clausewitzian and all that sort of thing. And yet for somebody like Milosevic, as a civilian dictator effectively, he didn't give a stuff about the Yugoslav National Army. There was no way it was anywhere close to a strategic center of gravity for him. His hold on power, his hold on the black market, Serbian Socialist Party, all of these things were much closer to it. Interestingly, the air component commander at the time understood intuitively what was necessary to take Milosevic's center of gravity out, but was overruled by the land guy.
Yeah.
And that's as good a demonstration as to why you need senior airmen in those positions. And there is a huge risk if you get rid of air forces that you won't bring up those people and you'll have to leave it to somebody else. If you leave it to somebody else, you take their decisions and you have to follow them. So I think the other side of it is that do we actually need separate services is a debate that ended in Britain years ago with the formation of the Unitary Ministry of Defence, where I was saying earlier that the Royal Air Force came about for the need to have its own spending line, its own boat. That went when the MOD replaced the War Office, the Air Ministry, the Admiralty. Yeah. So that's gone. It's all centrally funded. So I don't see there being an argument, really.
I'm going to bring up Haig, if that's okay, because I know you've already addressed this, but the topic that has continued, and it did the last time we ran through, was focusing on the lions led by donkeys historiography. And in the first instance, I think there were individuals who were asking, why are we talking about this, which we can address in the first instance. But then beyond that, I wanted to know if you wanted to offer some thoughts about just sort of strategic command and sort of high level command in the British Army and the Royal Flying Corps during the First World War.
You go first on this one, man.
Well, I think one of the major reasons why we have this debate and why we should continue to have this debate is that, especially with us being within the centenary celebrations of the First World War, it's important as a society how we view the First World War. Do we view it as Alan Clark's lions led by donkeys, the men at the top are all buffoons? Or do we see it as a learning curve and that this is the only possible way to win the First World War?
Yeah, I think there's a lot in that. I think the how often do we hear in just general debate around the First World War this phrase of lions led by donkeys? And it's the sort of thing that crops up at almost every level of discussion. I was sitting on the train coming back from London yesterday, and that was the subject of conversation. And it was just trotted out without any thought whatsoever as to the accuracy of the statement. It is still rehearsed in schools. It is still rehearsed at school level history. It's rehearsed by historians across the globe. And it's one of those discussions that just keeps coming back, keeps coming back.
Well, it's here, isn't it?
Yeah. What are your thoughts on it, James?
Well, it's, I mean, I mean, to address why we discuss it in the first instance, and this is one of the primary goals of my research, which again, I bored my audience at the RAF Museum the other week, is to make sure that we understand air power in its wider context during the First World War. And it's not an independent air service until the end of the war. And so air power is used within the organisational, cultural context of the British Army and the Royal Navy. So in the first, if we're talking about the Royal Flying Corps, we desperately need to understand wider debates relating to the British Army in order that we understand how the Royal Flying Corps works and operates during that conflict. And it's really interesting because if we talk again about, well, we've got Haig, of course. If we talk about perhaps the most famous air power command, British air power commander, Sir Hugh Trenchard, he was, had a very, very close working relationship with Haig, and was clearly influenced by Haig's approach to warfare during the First World War. In a personal sense and in an organisational sense, the Royal Flying Corps was a part of the British Army. If the British Army conducts itself in a particular way, the Royal Flying Corps has to conduct itself in that way too. There is an institutional pressure. So I think that's a really interesting one. The other thing which has come up on the boards a fair bit is the idea that these individuals from the past, Haig in particular, is either stupid or ignorant. And I must subscribe to that view. When I first came to this, there's certainly a way of looking at the past, and you're a modern, we've come a long way in terms of science and education and various things. And you look at the past and you feel it's an old play. They didn't understand stuff, but it's very, very easy to then look at Haig and think, he's making all these mistakes. The guy's an idiot. And then you, if you stop for a minute and think, actually, this guy's been through all of the educational establishments within the British Army of the era. He really takes his job really seriously. If things aren't going right, why is that? Yes, it could be on a personal level. He hasn't quite grasped what he's supposed to be doing. But more likely than that, there are other contextual factors that are forcing his hand. And I think that's a really interesting element.
Yeah, I think so. If you look at high-level leadership, at strategic leadership, let's not kid ourselves that this is an easy business.
No.
It is seriously complex. It is very ambiguous. And you're not just dealing with the stuff in front of you, the trench lines and all the rest of it. Haig would be spending a significant proportion of his time dealing around his command. He'd be dealing with the interfaces between the command and the other services, be dealing with the logistical side of it, he'd be dealing with the political side of it, and he'd be dealing with the French. So he had a lot on his plate. So complex, ambiguous, difficult to cope with. I think the other thing that we have to bear in mind is that once you start a major attritional campaign, you're going to get attrition.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, that sounds really callous, but you're going to lose people, and you're going to lose a lot of them unless your politicians can find a way of breaking the deadlock. So without getting into counterfactual history, if we're going to start throwing snowballs around this particular fight saying these people were stupid, what diplomatic means were being explored around the various combatants to say, sorry, you're going to have to leave France. Out you go. Go on, Germany. Back into Germany, or just to finish the war. And this isn't happening. So the attrition is going to continue. The Germans, as I think Matthew made the point in one of the posts, when they fell back from the early maneuver warfare, they settled into well defensible positions, and they really didn't have to do anything. They could hold it all from there. And it was up to the French and British to kick them out. And you're going to take losses. When you look at the Second World War, and when you look at the number of senior generals, senior airmen for that matter, who were removed from command, and,
Yeah.
there were plenty of people, the politicians could have kicked Haig out if he was doing a bad job on many, many occasions. But the perception until Lloyd George takes power is that Haig's actually doing a pretty decent job.
Yeah.
And it's only the bad mouthing that Lloyd George, we give Alan Clark the credit or the blame for starting lions led by donkeys, but really it was Lloyd George that started it all. Why was he starting it? Well, covering backsides springs to mind in terms of we didn't find a better way out of this. We weren't able to control the war from London and from Paris any better than Haig was from where he was doing his day job. So I think there are a lot of factors. Go on, Matthew.
I think to delve some slightly deeper into the point you made about the fact that you have to kick the Germans out. People have said on the boards that tactics didn't change. And it appears that tactics don't change because they all have to be incorporated around one form of attack, and that is the frontal assault. And given, especially from 1916, 1917 onwards, the German defence in depth, where they have two lines of frontline trenches that they'll defend thinly and then will fall back into reserve trenches with mutually supporting machine gun positions and use their already ranged artillery to cut off the men who've advanced this far. This sort of attack is going to take heavy casualties. There is simply, as Pete said, there is simply no other way around this. A frontal assault against a machine gun or several machine gun posts will result in the attackers losing heavily. One of the things that the British do in 1917 is they begin to incorporate what's called the bite and hold technique, where they move up, they take the first line of trenches, and then reserves are put forward and continue the attack. And this is done at a slower pace to allow the logistical side of things to catch up, to allow fresh troops to come in, and to allow artillery to come up and be retrained and focused onto the second, third line of defences, which is where the Germans really make their presence known. And at points, these defences could be up to about a mile in depth. And so what it does is it makes the break in exceptionally easy to do, but it also then makes the break out of this defensive system exceptionally difficult. And there's another thing that people have said, that why was Haig obsessed with using cavalry? Well, there's a very good reason for this. It's because the motor transport tanks will not be as quick, will not be as reliable over the ground on the Western Front. If you can achieve that breakout, cavalry is still the fastest way to move on the battlefield at this time.
Yeah, and it's interesting that the horse as a form of military transport was used by those master proponents of blitzkrieg almost to the exception of all other forms of transport. It's very easy to forget these things. They're very, very useful. Horses, mules, pack animals, etc. Go on, James.
I was just going to steer us on to a technological discussion, because I know that there's quite a lot of people interested in talking about that.
Yep.
And again, I'm sorry to keep going back this RAF Museum talk, but I got into trouble last week, or the week before last, for sort of, well, I didn't talk about it, and I said it's really important, but there's a lot of other things there. Would you want to talk a little bit about the relationship between air power and technology, and just sort of wider themes around that? It's obviously a crucial part of it, but
it is a crucial part of it, and it's one of those new soul type things that air power is about technology. It is technology. It's the magic of technology, and it draws people who are interested in technology are drawn to air power as being one of the most advanced forms of it. Ditto space power, ditto computers, and so on it goes. But it's relatively accessible. We could have done a MOOC that was based around a deep technology, count the number of rivets on that, we could go into detail on as we were talking about before we started this, on interrupter gear and how it was developed and whether there were patent issues and whether Anthony Fokker stole the patents and shouldn't have done, how much of it was being, how much of it was dependent on capturing downed aeroplanes, how this translates into the Second World War, electronic warfare side of it, where people were reluctant to deploy technology in case it was captured and countered electronically or otherwise. So we could go into that. We could go into the detail on aerofoil shapes, on aerofoil design, on production line techniques, on glue technologies which were being developed at a rapid rate of knots. And some of that came out interestingly in the discussion on women in factories. So bits of it were there. My contention is, and certainly when we designed this MOOC, we were really after some of the big ideas. Those that are interested in the technology can normally find it relatively easy, whether it's through Wikipedia, whether it's through the well-known technical websites that are out there. It's relatively accessible. And that's why we started, to go back to your earlier comment, that's why we started with Tennyson. Let's go back to some of these earlier ideas. And I have to say, on that side of it, some of the food for thought that we got from you guys out there in terms of other early references were just superb.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I really enjoyed that. We certainly do have, and I talked to a number of participants about this. We do have a Western focus in terms of, you know, our understanding of air power, and within that, of course, we focus down on the British experience by and large for a variety of reasons. But it was so interesting to have people bring in, you know, the early aviation history of Southeast Asia, and looking at how very, very early ancient Chinese cultures thought about flight and wrote about flight. And then there was also references to, you know, to Babylonian scriptures and references. It's clearly a topic that has fascinated human beings since before recorded history began.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I was really interested by suggestions that humans may have flown before in the past. I mean, it's, you know, unfortunately it's hideously counterfactual because we don't have the evidence. But it's a really interesting suggestion to think that perhaps there was flight before, you know, perhaps it was a technology that was lost and rediscovered again. I don't know how human history works really in that sort of scale and depth. But anyway, sorry, that's me off on one again. Yeah.
I think anything to add on that?
Nothing from me.
Oh, that's cool. Let me have a look. Let me see if we can find a couple of questions here. Well, I mean, there's a focus here. Zoe Brain is mentioning various things to do with the air defence of the United Kingdom, and it's basically relating to the formation of the RAF was essential only, if only for home defence. Do we think that's fair? There is a big sort of home defence element to the creation of the RAF during the First World War.
Yeah, it's absolutely crucial. Absolutely right. And it remains so to this day.
Do we? I mean, that's one of the key things to bear in mind. You know, with regards to the Smuts reports, and we talk about the second Smuts report, and that's really interesting because it is the second Smuts report. The first Smuts report is all about sort of focusing down on localized air defence within the UK and making sure that you've actually got a local air defence system in place there. So he's sort of making some suggestions that you know, air defence was a shambles prior to this point, and I think that might be a bit too strong. I don't think it's a job that either the Royal Flying Corps or the Royal Naval Air Service wanted to do in particular. They've got a finite number of resources. If they use stuff in home defence, it takes away from using air power and other roles. And I think in a cultural sense as well, or, you know, an organisation sense, they don't want to defend; they want to attack. That's what both organisations are about.
It's the classic line that Trenchard would come out with time and time again in the interwar years, that trying to defend Britain by air was like having a football team with 12 goalkeepers.
I thought you'd use that one.
I've only got a certain number of lines, James. You know that. That's why you keep hearing them again. And there's a certain amount of truth in that. It's also worth just thinking back, as we were doing with Haig, But you're sitting there in the dark of night on quick reaction alert in some North London field, and it's just a field. There's no radar. There are none of the electronic aids that we know today, but somebody with a pair of binoculars has heard a goater or something else coasting in, heading towards London. You get airborne. It's by definition, it's dark. They've got it meant us to fly by night. It had provided 2 suns. It's miserable. It's dark. It's probably miserable. It's probably raining. There'll be clouds. You're in an open cockpit, and you've got to go up there and find this proverbial needle in a haystack. And you're going to get, you've got to find your way back. You've got no navigational aids. You can't map read because there are no clues. They've turned out all the lights. It's just the most miserable job going. It really is.
But
awful.
I think a really interesting point is, and there's a couple of really good sources I can recommend on the reading list, particularly with air defence during the First World War and beyond. And John Ferris, a Canadian historian, is someone. They're not the easiest sources to find. They're quite academic, so I'd probably try and go through your local library if you can, and they're not cheap either. Again. But John Ferris makes a note that at various points prior to the Smuts report, Britain's air defences do actually master the threat that is being put at them. So the airship threat is mastered and defeated before Smuts. And it's really interesting. I did an exercise where I tracked the press responses to air defence issues, and I looked at every edition of the Daily Mail, which was an experience, from the First World War. And it's really interesting because we're focusing on air defence, we're focusing on the Smuts report, and it was a really big deal. But it was just one of many big deals, and it wasn't always the top thing in the political and public mind. And that's to do with the fact that there is a rhythm to air raids. Of course, they can only happen at certain points in the year. But another thing is, at various points, Britain's air defences prior to Smuts or anything bested what was being sent against them. It was very unfortunate that they were really caught with their pants down when the Gothas came over. And there were various parts of the story there that drove the press mad. For example, there had been the first Gotha raids take place. You actually get orders from the cabinet to withdraw some squadrons from the Western Front to protect London. They hang around for about 2 weeks. Nothing happens. They sent out on the day they're sent back. The next raid comes over, and it drives them mad.
Yeah. Understandably so.
Yeah. To take us further forward, if I may, Lee Harper, and Lee, thank you so much for all your posts. We've really enjoyed debating with you over the last few weeks. It's been great. And this is certainly a question for Dr. Gray. What is your opinion of the future of pilotless aircraft, in essence? And I think that's a thing that's come out. We've talked about the ethics and things. This is the real hot topic in modern air power studies now. Is pilotless aircraft. Well, that's not quite the right term, I suppose, really, because you do still have a pilot.
There is still a pilot there. I'm not totally convinced it is that hot a topic. It is, but I think there are elements of it which are seriously contentious, which I'll come to in a moment. I think they're here to stay. They have an incredible loiter time over targets, which if you're sitting in a Tornado, if you're sitting in any of the surveillance aeroplanes, you just don't have. The F-35 will be up there for a given length of time, and it'll be a fraction of what you can deploy an unoccupied, remotely piloted, whatever you want to call it. I think the remotely piloted side of it is important. In putting together the Policy Commission, and you'll have seen us all referencing the Policy Commission report, we took evidence from a lot of places. And I think one of the things that came out of it very strongly was that when you're sitting in a cabin, and it doesn't matter where the cabin is, it can be near Las Vegas, it can be near Lincoln, it can actually be out in theatre, it really doesn't matter. But if you're there for 8 or 10 or 12 hours, and you're watching a series of targets, you get used to the pattern of life around those targets in a way that a ground observer might be able to do, but of course you've got the third dimension from which to see it. But this pattern of life you become accustomed to. You can start giving people in the that's person A. Oh, that's Uncle George coming out now. And you can watch how life develops. One of the simpler ways of doing this is you can watch the children playing in the street. And we know from Afghanistan that one of the things that if you watch a village long enough, you know when something's going to happen because they pull the kids off the street. And if you're there and you're watching it for that length of time, you've got that overview. It's non-intrusive. People say, well, we hear them in the sky above. The size of the engines and all the rest of it, when they're operating at 8 or 10,000 feet, no, you don't hear them. They're largely invisible. You think they might be there, but you don't necessarily know unless you just happen to get a glint of one in the sunlight. So you get that side of it. You see something happening. You see a targeted, something that you might want to target. You've got other sources of intelligence than just, dare I say it, the drone. Okay, is this within the rules of engagement? You have the time and the capability in that cabin to call in your legal advisor, to call in the senior officer and say, this is what we see. Well, are you sure about that? And these debates do happen. There is a line of thought that says, well, you don't feel part of it, you're not engaged. Some research that's been done by one of my colleagues in the UK shows that the post-traumatic stress disorder amongst drone operators is higher than in ordinary aircrew. They are seriously involved in the prospect. I think the final point, and this is where, to my mind, it does get hot, and that's the degree of automation. We spent a long time with the Policy Commission looking at what we meant by autonomous piloted aircraft. And we basically mean that they are programmed. It's a robot. It goes off and it does its own thing. And a retired legal advisor came to us and said, well, if it's truly autonomous, it will get airborne and then decide which side it's on. And that's pretty gobsmacking when you think about it. From my perspective, having been involved in various bits on the inside of targeting, on the inside of weapons release and operating ordinary aeroplanes, one of the things that worries me and worries everybody, and it therefore won't happen, is if this is being written by a computer geek in whichever Silicon Valley it happens to be, is the Attorney General or the Prime Minister or with whom weapons release rests watching every line of code as it's written, monitoring what's in the system? Because unless they have that level of confidence, they're not going to allow it to happen. Because certainly in parliamentary democracies, the politicians take this responsibility incredibly seriously. So the topic that most excited our witnesses on the Policy Commission was on automation. Things become more automatic, but the purely autonomous self-thinking is some way away. And you can get into this debate beyond Star Wars, beyond all these other things, with what we're really talking about here is artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
How close are we to that?
Well, it was on that topic and off topic too. There was a news story on the BBC website. Yes. They apparently Google engineers have managed to create an artificial intelligence program which starts with nothing and then learns how to define a computer game and win it in the most effective way it can. It really isn't sort of quite a basic at this stage, I suppose, example of artificial intelligence, which when I watched the video I found it a bit scary. And I suppose that comes back to one of those themes, one of our wider themes, that air power has been such a provider of hope and fascination, but it also scares the bejesus out of everybody.
I think that's right. It's the fear and fascination with which we started the whole exercise. And there is real fear there over this. I think the level of technology that's necessary to get something that sophisticated and field it is quite something. And certainly as far as whether it's the CIA, whether it's the United States Air Force, whether it's the UK Air Force, I don't see that coming in, who knows, go down on record as saying in 5 years, 10 years. What I can see is that the safeguards necessary to ensure that it is delivered in a safe way or just not delivered at all are all there. And that was one of the recommendations we made about a ban on this technology within the Policy Commission side of it. What other nations will do, who knows?
One thing, if I bring us, I suppose we're running out of time a little bit, does sort of link to Lee's question again, the pilotless aspect of it, and you mentioned about drone operators, to use that term, sort of suffering quite heavily with PTSD. One of the interesting things that came out of conversations on the board relating to the Royal Flying Corps, and it's several conversations I had, is that we don't really know very much about the mental health of pilots from the First World War. It's a topic I'm hoping to address myself, and there's a scholar at the University of Oxford, Lindsay Shaw, who's just about to submit her PhD on neuropsychiatry in the RAF. She touches upon that a bit. But I just thought perhaps from your perspective as a former airman, Peter, just sort of talking a little bit about the psychological side of things and how that worked in the First World War, and perhaps from your own experience of it too.
I might be old, but I'm not that old, James.
Oh, I'm sorry, Peter.
Not from the First World War.
No.
Of it. It's one of those things, I don't know. Some people, failure to withstand the stress of flying, I think we called it in my day, rather than PTSD. And it's there. There is no doubt at all that flying can be a dangerous and a scary business. And there are different coping mechanisms. And you've looked at some of the coping mechanisms when it comes to taking drugs. One of the standard coping mechanisms in the First World War was drinking to excess, heavy drinking. Well, you're going to kill yourself if you drink that much. Well, I might well be killed a long time before my liver packs in. Thank you very much. That sort of line of approach. And certainly in my flying career, there were different coping mechanisms for better or worse. One of the best ones I found in these things is being in control of the situation. And the more you know what's going on around about you, the better you become as an aviator and the less stressful it becomes. In an open cockpit solo in the First World War, being in control of that situation is hugely difficult, particularly when you come under fire. So it's a very difficult question, and it remains so. There is, in most forms of fighting, you can always get back to where you started roughly. If you're a soldier, you're on the ground. If you're a seaman, a mariner, you're on the ship and you can get the ship back to shore. Once you get airborne, that's a whole new ball game, and that third dimension is very difficult to conquer. Anybody who's flown a glider in particular with no engine will understand exactly what I'm talking about. It's up to you and the machine to get home safely, and that can be very, very stressful.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I linked some participants to a really interesting book by a flight surgeon, in essence, an early flight surgeon from the Royal Naval Air Service. And that's the key thing to remember, particularly during the First World War, is the science of aviation medicine, as we'd call it now, is just, there's just nothing there at all. They literally are learning as they go.
Yeah.
And one of the really interesting, and this links back to our discussion of Haig and Trenchard, these guys that don't care about the people that work for them, they're willing to send them up to their deaths. Well, that's true. They are willing to take responsibility to send the individuals out there. But if the individuals perform well and perform as they should, they're willing to give them rest breaks. And that's one of the most astonishing things I've seen in the archives, particularly with this Lions led by Don Keating. There is letters from Trenchard to Haig saying, this squadron has worked really, really, really hard. They're having a really rough time. They could really do with a break. Is that okay? And the general Melchett response, of course not. They're there to stay. And Haig says, of course, they've worked really hard. They need some rest. Let's take them back. Let's take care of those guys. And that's a really interesting, because there is no formal policy at this point, as there is now, governing air crew rest and various things.
Yeah.
They're making up as they're going along, but they're very, they're comparatively compassionate with it. And I think that's a really it's another really interesting element of the debate.
I think it's worth, if you can get hold of a copy, having a look at Maurice Baring's memoirs of the First World War. He was effectively Trenchard's diary man and all the rest of it. And his memoirs, Royal Flying Corps Headquarters, Trenchard is day in, day out, many hours of many days, is talking to the squadrons and is writing back to London to say, we need this improvement, that improvement, the other improvement. And he is very far from being a donkey over this. There is a degree of compassion, understanding. Some of it might just be, well, you'll be more efficient if we get these things. But he also cares about what he's doing. That becomes very, very clear. The overall aim may well be operational efficiency, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. If you're operationally efficient, you're going to lose less people in the longer term. I think we're running out of time now. Just in snapshot terms, guys, we get as much out of these programs as you all do, and in some cases, an awful lot more. What have you taken away from this particular run through?
One of the things that I've taken away from it, one of the things I've enjoyed the most, is the discussion I've had that's been based partly on my PhD, which has been looking at the Peary battle aircraft and the Battle of France. And it links back into my current research as to why we were using aircraft like the Battle and why we didn't have better aircraft, why the RAF isn't capable of conducting the strategic air offensive. And that sort of made me reconsider some of my views about the Battle. It's an aircraft that, as I've said on the boards, I have a soft spot for after my PhD research, but it has made me reconsider my views on the RAF's attitude and also the government and the economic position in terms of rearmament, and why we end up sending aircraft that are essentially obsolescent or obsolete to fight in France in 1940.
Yeah, there's an awful lot in that. I think we also have to bear in mind the capability of industry to go what was effectively from depression through into a full-scale war industry, where it's all very well looking at the standard computer-generated robots that make modern cars and aeroplanes. But when you think of the tradesmen that you need to turn out aeroplanes in those numbers, where are you going to get them from? They have to be trained. What was the standard apprenticeship? 3 to 5 years. Well, I'm sorry, Mr. Hitler, can you wait until we've trained our apprentices, please? You have to look at the industrial side of it. Takeaway point, James?
I've really enjoyed discussions with participants on the 2 discussion points we had relating to chivalry, because I think I've got a view that's probably at odds with most historians on there, and I think that chivalric ideas and values continue to shape the air war in the First World War, even after the point where it's moved from it sort of being one-on-one, and you can easily understand where chivalric ideals work and where they come from. But beyond that point, when it's squadrons against squadrons, I still think that chivalric ideas are there, and they're almost a cultural touchstone for the pilots. It helps them understand their world. It helps them cope. And I've had some really interesting discussions and eye-opening discussions with participants. We've had some really interesting semantic debates, and I use that word in a complimentary sense, not a dismissive sense, about what the word actually means and the context in which it's used. I've had some really interesting ideas around a couple of participants suggesting that respect is perhaps a better word and more interesting. And it's as with Matt and yourself, it sort of forced me to rethink some of the things that I feel about it. And that's been, again, it's one of the absolute best parts of MOOC. We get to oversee about 1,000 minds all working away at this, and everyone's got their own unique, their own unique perspective. We can't think of everything, and it's just, I don't know, it's been so refreshing to have to, just have these new ideas.
Yeah.
And these are some assumptions that we hold about the importance of air power. Someone asks you a very basic question, and you're like, oh my, I've never thought of it like that before. And it's one of the joys of being able to teach, isn't it? That's brilliant.
Yeah, absolutely. I think from my side of it, it's been really great to have the opportunity to reach out to so many people that we wouldn't otherwise have. Male, female, across the whole globe. The response has been superb. So thank you all very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.